My name is Reagan Caldwell. I am 32 years old. For 12 years, I flew Black Hawk helicopters for the United States Army, the kind of soldier they trusted to bring everyone on board home alive. And on Thanksgiving morning, while I sat alone in a diner in Killeen, Texas, because my mother had called me 3 days earlier and told me not to come home, that my pregnant sister didn't want drama at the table, I opened my phone and saw a photograph my sister had just posted of the four of them sitting around our family's dinner table, smiling, with a caption that read, "Grateful for my people. These are the ones who matter most." And when I zoomed in and counted the chairs, there were exactly 4, not 5. Because the place where I had sat for every holiday since I was a child had been removed as cleanly and as completely as if I had never been born into that family at all. I sat in the back booth of that diner with my hands shaking around a fork I couldn't lift, and I remember thinking that I had spent 12 years flying into places where the ground wanted to kill me, and none of it had ever hurt as much as the sight of a dinner table that no longer had room for my chair. This is the part that still makes something tighten behind my ribs every time I tell it, and I've told it more than once now. There's something about counting the chairs in a photograph of your own family and realizing the math doesn't include you. I think anyone who has ever been quietly left out of a room they thought they belonged in knows exactly what that math feels like. I'd love to know where you're listening from right now, so leave your city and state in the comments. It always means something to me to know how far a story like this can travel. And please take a second to press the like button and subscribe, because that photograph wasn't the beginning. It was the proof. And to understand how I ended up sitting alone in that diner, I need to take you back to the phone call that started everything 3 days before. The phone call had come on a Tuesday, just as the late November sun was dropping behind the dry, scrub-covered hills west of Killeen, throwing long amber shadows across the parking lot of my apartment complex on Rancier Avenue. I had already submitted my leave request through the chain of command at the Combat Aviation Brigade, finished my post-flight maintenance reports for the week, and driven to the HEB on West Stan Schluter Loop to buy a case of Shiner Bock and a bag of Texas pecans to bring home to my parents as a small gesture of peace from a daughter they hadn't seen since the previous Christmas. My mother's name had appeared on the screen of my phone, and for a single, foolish second, I felt that familiar spark of warmth. The kind of feeling that a soldier carries when they know the mission is almost over, and the only thing left to do is go home and be someone's daughter instead of someone's pilot. My mother, Lorraine Caldwell, 58 years old, a retired elementary school principal from Bryn Mawr, Pennsylvania, a woman who had spent her career tending to the emotional needs of other people's children and never once managed to see her own, did not say hello. She did not ask if I was tired from the flight hours, or if the Texas heat had finally let up, or how the last deployment cycle had treated me. Her voice came through the phone flat and measured, the voice of someone reading a verdict she had already decided on long before she picked up the receiver. And she told me that my younger sister, Paige Caldwell, 28, a woman who had built an entire identity around the fragile architecture of her own comfort, was pregnant again, and that the doctors had told her she needed a completely stress-free environment, which apparently meant my presence at the family table was no longer required. "I don't understand, Mom," I said, and I could hear the crack forming in my own voice as I gripped the edge of my kitchen counter so hard the veins in my forearm stood out against the skin. "What drama? I haven't spoken to my sister since last Christmas, and even then I barely said 10 words because she spent the entire dinner talking about her pregnancy announcement." My mother exhaled that long, practiced sigh. The sound she had perfected over 3 decades of making me feel like my confusion was the real problem. And she told me that my tendency to make everything about myself was precisely the kind of energy she was trying to keep out of the house this year. I stood there in my Army flight suit, the patches of the 1st Cavalry Division still pressed against my shoulder, looking at the duffel bag on my bed and the case of Shinerbach I had just carried up 2 flights of stairs, and I felt something inside me go very still, the way the air goes still in a cockpit right before a warning light comes on. I had spent 12 years in the United States Army flying Black Hawk helicopters over terrain that would kill you if you lost focus for a single second. And I had survived 3 separate deployments to places where the ground shook and the sky burned. But standing in that apartment in Killeen, I realized that none of that mattered to the woman on the phone. Because to my mother, I wasn't the pilot who had been trusted with lives and machines worth millions of dollars. I was just the difficult daughter, the one whose very existence was a disruption to the careful, fragile peace she had built around my sister's needs. And no matter how many missions I flew, or how many soldiers I brought home safe, I would always be the person they asked to disappear so that my sister could breathe a little easier. The memories began to surface then, rising up through the years like instruments on a panel that I had been ignoring for too long, each one blinking with a quiet urgency that demanded to be read. I sat on the edge of my bed and stared at the far wall, where a framed photo from Fort Rucker, Alabama, the Army's aviation school, showed me standing in front of a Black Hawk on the day I earned my wings, my flight helmet tucked under my arm, and my face lit with the kind of pride that comes from surviving something that most people never even attempt. My parents were not in that photograph. They had told me the trip from Pennsylvania to Alabama was too far for a ceremony that only lasted an hour, though they had driven twice that distance the month before to attend my sister's baby shower at a resort in the Poconos. I remembered my 16th birthday, a day I had been counting down to for months, not because I expected anything extraordinary, but because it was supposed to be the one afternoon where I was the reason people gathered in the same room. I had picked out a cake from the bakery near our house, lemon with white frosting, and my mother had promised me that we would spend the day at Valley Forge, just the 2 of us, walking through the fields where she used to take me when I was small. But the phone had rung that morning, and I watched the light drain from her face as she listened to my sister crying on the other end about a chemistry test she had failed, or a boy who hadn't texted back, or whatever emergency my sister had manufactured that week. And within 15 minutes, my birthday had been folded up and put away like a tablecloth nobody needed, replaced by a 3-hour drive to my sister's apartment to provide what my mother called undivided emotional support. I spent my 16th birthday sitting in the back seat of the car, watching the Pennsylvania Turnpike blur past the window, and my mother told me that I was being dramatic and that we could celebrate another time, though that other time never actually arrived. Then there was the day I graduated from flight school at Fort Rucker, a moment I had bled for through months of grueling training, early morning flights, and written exams that tested everything I knew about aerodynamics, weather systems, and the physics of keeping a 22,000-pound machine in the air. I had called my parents the week before and told them the date and the time and the building, and my father had said he would be there, his voice carrying the careful, non-committal tone of a man who had learned to make promises he had no intention of keeping. When I walked across that stage and looked into the crowd, searching for the 2 faces that should have been the easiest to find, their chairs were empty. Because my sister had a routine ultrasound appointment that simply couldn't be rescheduled, and my parents had chosen, once again, to be somewhere else. I had spent my entire adult life trying to become smaller, quieter, and more accommodating, believing that if I could just be the perfect soldier and the perfect daughter simultaneously, I would eventually earn a permanent seat at the table, instead of the folding chair they brought out when they remembered I existed. But sitting on that bed in Colleen, with the distant sound of rotor blades from the Fort Cavazos flight line humming through the window, I finally understood something I had been refusing to see. There was no version of me, no rank, no mission, no sacrifice that would ever be easy enough for people who had already decided that my purpose in the family was to be the one who absorbed the silence so that everyone else could make noise. I decided to call my father, hoping that the man who had once driven me to the recruiter's office and told me that the Army would teach me what it meant to stand on my own, might finally find a word to say in my defense. My father, Glenn Caldwell, 61 years old, a semi-retired commercial insurance adjuster from Pennsylvania, who spent his entire career evaluating other people's damages but never once filed a claim on behalf of his own daughter, answered the phone with the voice of a man who already knew what I was calling about and had already decided not to help. "You know how your mother is, Ray," he said, using the nickname he gave me when I was 5, as if the intimacy of the word could make up for the emptiness of the sentiment. "It's just one dinner. Let this one go." "Do you want me there, Dad?" I asked, and I could hear the rawness in my own voice, the sound of a question I had been too afraid to ask for over a decade. He didn't answer for a long time, the silence on the line broken only by the distant sound of a football game playing on the television in their living room in Bryn Mawr. And then he told me that he thought it was better for everyone if I just listened to my mother this year. Something went quiet inside me in that moment, a kind of stillness I had only ever felt in the seconds before a difficult approach. A cold, clear recognition that the people I called my family were no longer my crew, and the home I was trying to fly back to was a runway that had been closed to me long before I ever lifted off. I told him, "Okay, Dad." And I ended the call before he could tell me not to be like that. And then I sat in the silence of my apartment and watched the last light disappear behind the Texas hills, knowing that if there was no chair for me at their table, I would have to learn how to build my own. Thanksgiving morning arrived in Central Texas the way it always does, hot and dry and golden. The sky a pale, washed-out blue that stretches flat and wide in every direction, as if the land itself is exhaling. I woke to the sound of children running through the hallway of my apartment building, their voices bright and careless with the energy of a day that belonged to them. And I lay in bed for a long time, listening to the sounds of people who knew exactly where they were going and who was waiting for them when they got there. I made a pot of coffee and sat on my small balcony, watching the cars pull out of the parking lot one by one, loaded with covered dishes and relatives, and the particular kind of noise that only happens when a family is together and no one is missing. I spent the morning the way a soldier spends any day when the mission has been canceled and there is nowhere to report. I cleaned. I polished my flight boots until the leather caught the light. I reorganized the aviation manuals on my bookshelf, and I scrubbed the kitchen counter until it shone, as if the order I could impose on the surfaces around me might somehow quiet the disorder in my chest. I thought about the commissary on Fort Cavazos, how crowded it would have been the day before with military families stocking up on cranberry sauce and frozen pies and the big cans of green beans that every Army household keeps in the pantry. And I felt a hollow, ringing ache for a tradition I had never actually been allowed to fully claim. By noon, the silence in the apartment had become a physical thing, a pressure in my ears that reminded me of the altitude changes in a Black Hawk when you climb too fast. And I knew that if I stayed inside one more hour, the walls were going to start closing in. I grabbed my keys and my jacket and walked out into the bright, empty afternoon, determined to find a place that didn't feel like a holding pattern. Honestly, this is the part that still sits with me when I think about it. You've been around long enough to know that sometimes the hardest thing in the world is just walking through a door when you don't know who's on the other side. Tell me in the comments, what would you have done if this was your family and you were the one sitting in an empty apartment on the one day of the year when no one is supposed to be alone? And please take a second to press the like button and subscribe. Because what I found at the end of that drive through Killeen changed the entire direction of my life, and I didn't even know it yet. I drove aimlessly through the streets of Killeen, past the closed-up Whataburger on Veterans Memorial Boulevard and the empty lots near Fort Hood Street. The town wearing the strange, half-asleep expression it always had on holidays, when the soldiers were either home with their families or deployed somewhere far away. I found myself heading toward the older part of town, past the pawn shops and the tire stores, and the small churches with their parking lots full of pickup trucks, until I saw a place I had passed 100 times on my way to the flight line, but had never once stopped at. The Lone Star Diner. An old brick building with a faded neon sign and a gravel parking lot filled with more cars than I expected on a day when most restaurants in Killeen were dark. I sat in the parking lot for a long time, my hands on the steering wheel, telling myself that a woman eating alone on Thanksgiving was a sight I wasn't ready to be. But then, I thought about the duffel bag in my apartment and the mother who had called me drama. And I decided that I was done being invisible in the dark. I pushed open the heavy door, and the sound of the restaurant hit me all at once. The clatter of silverware against heavy plates, the smell of smoked brisket and dark gravy and cornbread that had been baked until the edges were golden, and the low, steady hum of 100 different conversations layering on top of each other, like the sound of a place that was alive and full and holding nothing back. It was a sea of Texas families, men in pearl snap shirts and worn boots, grandmothers in their Sunday best, soldiers in civilian clothes leaning over their plates as if they were trying to memorize the taste of something they might not have again for months. I felt the hostess's eyes on me as I stood in the doorway in my jeans and my army field jacket, and for a long second I wanted to turn around and walk back out into the dry Texas wind, back to the safety of my own quiet. But she just smiled, a warm, unhurried smile that reached her eyes, and asked me if I was waiting for anyone. "Just me," I said, my voice louder than I intended in the crowded foyer. She didn't flinch, and she didn't look at me with the pity I had been bracing for. She just picked up a single menu and led me through the maze of tables to a 2-person booth in the back corner, right next to a large family that had taken over an entire section of the restaurant with the kind of confident, joyful chaos that only comes from people who have been gathering in the same place for decades. I sat down and opened the menu, but my eyes kept drifting to the people beside me. The way the children were, the way the younger man at the end of the table was listening to the woman at the head with the focused, respectful attention of someone who had been taught that paying attention is its own form of love. This was the kind of family I had spent my entire life trying to earn through performance, a structure held together by genuine warmth rather than the fragile, conditional silence my mother demanded. and watching them felt like pressing on a bruise I hadn't known was there. The waitress brought me the Thanksgiving plate: thick slices of smoked turkey, a hill of cornbread dressing, green beans slow-cooked with bacon, and a scoop of mashed potatoes drowning in cream gravy. And I picked up my fork, but my hand was shaking in a way that had nothing to do with hunger. I set the fork down and made the mistake of reaching for my phone, the habit of a pilot always checking for updates, and I opened the app without thinking. The evening before had been quiet and safe, a long stretch of hours where I had convinced myself that the worst was already over and that all I had to do was get through the next day without thinking too hard about a table in Pennsylvania. I had cleaned my apartment, folded my laundry, and even watched a movie on the couch with a blanket and a mug of coffee, telling myself that this was just another Thursday in Texas and that the silence was nothing I hadn't survived before. I went to bed believing that the worst they could do was ignore me, and that the morning would be easier than the night. And there it was, at the top of my feed, a photograph my sister had posted only minutes before, taken in the bright, warm light of the Pennsylvania afternoon I had been told I was too dangerous to attend. They were all there, gathered around the same table where I had sat for every holiday since I was old enough to hold a fork. And the caption read, "Grateful for my people. These are the ones who matter most." I zoomed in until the image blurred, counting the place settings with the clinical detachment I had learned from years of reading instrument panels in bad weather. And I felt the air leave my lungs when I saw that there were exactly 4 chairs pulled up to the table. They had not simply asked me to stay away. They had physically removed any evidence that a 5th person had ever been part of this family, filling the space where I should have been with a seamless, smiling portrait of people who were perfectly content to be whole without me. I pressed the napkin to my face, but it was too late. The sob came out before I could catch it. A small, wrecked sound that I hadn't made since the first night of my first deployment, when the loneliness of being far from home had felt like a weight on my chest that would never lift. I tried to turn my face toward the window, tried to do what I had always done: be invisible, be manageable, be the version of myself that didn't take up too much room. But the tears were falling now with a force that I could not command, and I sat in that booth in the back of the Lone Star Diner in Killeen, Texas, crying in front of strangers on a day when the rest of the world was holding hands and saying grace. Has someone ever erased you from a moment you were supposed to be part of, quietly, without warning, and left you to discover it through a screen while you sat somewhere alone? You don't have to share the whole story. Just leave a heart below if you've been there, so I know I'm not the only one who has felt that kind of cold. And please take a second to press the like button and subscribe, because what the woman sitting 5 feet away from me said next was the first honest thing anyone had told me in 32 years. I felt a presence beside me before I heard the voice, a shift in the air that was warm and deliberate, the way someone moves when they have spent a lifetime approaching people in pain without startling them. I looked up through the blur of my tears and saw the older woman from the head of the large table standing there, her silver hair catching the light from the window, and her eyes holding a steadiness that I hadn't encountered outside of a cockpit in a very long time. She didn't look at me with the fleeting, uncomfortable pity that most strangers offer to a crying woman in a restaurant. She looked at me with the calm, practiced gaze of someone who had spent decades learning how to see a wound, even when the person wearing it was trying to hold everything together. Her name was Maeve Holt, 63 years old, a retired registered nurse who had spent 30 years working at Darnell Army Medical Center, the hospital that sits right inside Fort Cavazos, taking care of soldiers and their families, which meant she had spent a lifetime learning how to find the person in the room who needed help and walk toward them without being asked. She didn't ask me if I was okay, because we both knew that I wasn't. And she didn't offer the kind of empty reassurance that people give when they want to feel better about someone else's pain. She just leaned down and said, in a voice as warm and unhurried as a Central Texas evening, "Honey, I have spent 30 years watching soldiers try to eat alone on holidays, and I have never once let it happen on my watch. So you're going to come sit with us and let someone hand you a plate that wasn't meant for a table of one." I tried to say something about allergies or the wind, the way you do when you are desperate to maintain the fiction that everything is fine, but she just smiled, a knowing, patient expression that made the lie die before it reached my mouth. And she told me that her family had an extra chair and more brisket than they could finish, and she wasn't about to walk back to her table knowing that a young woman in an army jacket was sitting alone in the corner on Thanksgiving. I looked at her, then at the loud, warm family waiting for her to return, and for the first time in 32 years, I felt a different kind of fear. Not the fear of being rejected, but the fear of being seen by someone who might actually know what they were looking at. I stood up on unsteady legs, leaving the cold plate behind, and followed her toward the center of the room, not knowing that I was walking toward the people who would eventually give me the one thing my biological family had spent 3 decades refusing to offer. The walk across the Lone Star Diner felt longer than any approach I had ever made in a Blackhawk, longer than the final descent into a landing zone in the dark, longer than the slow taxi across a flight line in a dust storm. Because this time, there was no instrument panel to read and no procedure to follow. Only the terrifying openness of walking toward strangers and hoping they would not look at me the way my family always had. But when we reached the table, the younger man I had been watching all afternoon stood up with a quiet, easy courtesy that reminded me of the soldiers I had flown with, the ones who moved through the world with a steadiness that came not from training, but from character. He pulled out a chair for me, his eyes meeting mine without asking for an explanation, and he introduced himself as Beckett Holt, 34, a high school history teacher, and the head varsity football coach at Killeen High School, which is the kind of job in Texas that means the whole town knows your name and your Friday night record. And he carried the weight of that responsibility with the same quiet decency his mother had just shown me across the restaurant. "This is my son, Beckett," the retired nurse said, settling me into the chair beside her with the practiced gentleness of a woman who had spent 30 years helping people sit down when their legs weren't cooperating. "And the man at the other end is my husband, Nash. He was an Army man for 26 years before he finally let the rest of us have him back." Her husband, Nash Holt, 65, a retired master sergeant in the United States Army, which is a senior non-commissioned officer rank that meant he had spent over 2 decades being the person everyone else leaned on, the one the officers relied on to turn orders into results, and the one the younger soldiers looked to when the world got loud and confusing, lifted his glass of sweet tea in my direction with a nod that said more than any sentence could have, the simple, certain gesture of a man who had seen enough of life to know that sometimes all a person needs is to be acknowledged. I think most of us spend our lives trying to earn a seat at someone else's table, negotiating for space with the people who were supposed to save a place for us. And it is a strange and disorienting thing when you finally stop negotiating and find yourself sitting in a chair that someone pulled out for you without being asked, in a room full of people who don't need you to be smaller in order for them to feel whole. The brisket was thick and dark and tender, sliced from a cut that had been smoking since before dawn, and the cornbread was golden and crumbly in the way that only happens when someone has been making it for 40 years without ever changing the recipe. I ate slowly, letting the warmth of the food and the noise of the Holt family settle over me like a blanket. And for a few minutes, I forgot about the photograph on my phone, and the 4 chairs, and the woman in Pennsylvania who had decided I was expendable. But the retired nurse had not spent 3 decades at Darnall Army Medical Center by ignoring the things people tried to hide in the silence between their sentences. And as the plates began to empty, she turned her chair toward mine, her eyes sharpening into the focused, diagnostic gaze of a woman who had triaged thousands of soldiers and knew exactly what a wound looked like, even when the person insisted they were fine. "Honey," she said, her voice dropping into a register that felt as private as a hospital room with the door closed. "I've spent my life looking at people who are trying to hold themselves together, and I can see that you are carrying something that is too heavy for one person." I hesitated, the old habit of military composure and family-taught silence pulling at me from both sides. But there was something about the way she waited, patient, present, completely unhurried, that made the truth feel like the only thing I had left. I told her about the phone call, about my mother's flat voice telling me that my existence was a threat to my sister's peace, and about the photograph with the 4 chairs. I told her how I had spent 12 years in the Army, proving that I was capable of things most people couldn't even imagine, and that none of it had ever been enough for a mother who measured my worth by how little trouble I caused. I watched the retired nurse's expression shift from warmth to a cold, steady clarity, the look of a woman who had seen too many soldiers come through her hospital, carrying wounds that weren't caused by anything on a battlefield, but by the people who were supposed to be waiting for them at home. "I've spent 30 years in military medicine," she said, her hand coming to rest on mine with a firmness that felt like a diagnosis. "And the patients who worried me the most were never the ones with the visible injuries. They were the ones who had been taught to believe that asking for help was the same thing as being a burden, because someone in their life had convinced them that the best thing they could do for everyone was disappear." She looked at me with a fierce, protective light in her eyes and told me that my mother hadn't excluded me because I was difficult. She had excluded me because my strength was a mirror, and people who are determined to be small cannot stand to see their own reflection in someone who refuses to shrink. The months that followed that Thanksgiving changed the geography of my life in a way I hadn't thought was possible for a 32-year-old woman who had spent her entire adulthood believing that home was a place you earned through obedience. The retired nurse called my office at the Combat Aviation Brigade the following week, just to check on a fellow Fort Cavazos girl. And by the second Sunday of December, I found myself turning my truck off Interstate 35 and onto the gravel road that led to the Holt Ranch in Salado, Texas, a small town 20 miles south of Killeen, where the live oaks grew thick and the limestone fences ran alongside pastures dotted with cattle and bluebonnet stubble waiting for spring. The house was a long, white stone ranch with a tin roof and a wraparound porch, set beneath a canopy of live oak so old their branches bent toward the ground like arms trying to hold the earth together. The retired master sergeant opened the door before I could knock, handing me a cold bottle of Shiner Bock and telling me that his wife had made enough kolaches to feed the entire 1st Cavalry Division and that I was expected to do my part. I walked into a living room filled with photographs of people who genuinely appeared to enjoy being in the same frame. Beckett in his coaching polo, the retired nurse in her hospital whites, and the retired master sergeant standing in front of a formation of soldiers in a photograph that looked like it was taken somewhere in the desert a long time ago. Over the following 6 months, the ranch in Salado became my fixed point, the one coordinate on the map that I flew toward every weekend with the same certainty I used to fly toward a landing zone. Beckett and I became friends in the way that only people who have built their lives around serving others can. Sitting on the back porch with a plate of smoked sausage and 2 bottles of Shiner Bock, talking about the students he was trying to reach and the missions I was trying to forget. 2 people who had spent their careers holding others steady and had never quite figured out how to hold themselves. He didn't ask me to be quieter, and he didn't flinch when I told him about the phone call, or the photograph, or the 16-year-old girl who had watched her birthday get packed away like something nobody needed. He just listened with the patient, undivided attention of a man who understood that the truth was the only thing worth hearing. I hadn't received a single word from my biological family since that Thanksgiving. No Christmas card, no text on my birthday in February, no message to ask if I was still alive or still stationed at Fort Cavazos, or still flying missions over places that would have made them lose sleep if they had ever bothered to ask. And I remember thinking that I should feel a devastating, bottomless grief over their silence. But what I actually felt was a kind of clarity. The way the sky looks after a line of thunderstorms has moved through central Texas and left the air scrubbed clean and almost too bright to look at. For the first time in my life, I wasn't folding myself into a shape designed to fit inside someone else's expectations. I was becoming the woman I had always been underneath the shrinking, a person who did not need a mother's permission to exist. One afternoon in late April, while the Texas bluebonnets were turning the hillsides along Interstate 35 into rivers of deep indigo, and the Indian paintbrush was lighting the roadsides with streaks of orange and red, the retired nurse and I were sitting in her sunroom, the light falling across the limestone floor in warm, angled columns. She turned to me with that look I had come to recognize, the diagnostic gaze that meant she had been thinking about something for a long time and had finally decided it was ready to be said. And she asked me if I had ever heard of adult adoption under the Texas Family Code. I blinked, my mind automatically scrolling through the statutes the way a pilot scrolls through emergency procedures. But the personal weight of the words made my breath catch in a way that no regulation had ever done. She told me that the law allowed one adult to formally adopt another adult, creating a legal bond as real as any birth certificate, a new legal family, a new next of kin, a permanent, court-ordered recognition that the people who chose you were just as real as the people who made you, and that the choice itself was the strongest kind of proof that love is not an accident of blood, but an act of will. If you were standing where I was standing, after 32 years of being told that you were too much for the people who were supposed to love you the most, and someone offered you a legal, permanent way to join a family that had already shown you what love actually looks like, what would you do? Leave a yes or no in the comments. I genuinely want to know what you think about the idea of choosing your parents when the ones you were born to chose not to keep you. And please take a second to press the like button and subscribe. Here's what I decided. And once I signed those papers, there was no version of my old life left to go back to. I looked at the documents spread across the sunroom table. The legal language I had been trained to respect now being offered as a key to my own freedom. And I asked her if she was serious. If she and the retired master sergeant truly wanted to take on a 32-year-old warrant officer who came with 12 years of military baggage and a family that had closed the door. She laughed, a warm, full sound that filled the room the way her presence always filled any space she entered. And she told me that they hadn't considered me a stranger since the moment I sat down at their table in the Lone Star Diner, and that as far as the Holts were concerned, I had been their daughter since the day I chose to stay. The process took 4 months of paperwork, a series of hearings in the Bell County Courthouse, and a quiet, profound transformation that felt more significant than any set of wings I had ever been pinned with in the Army. When the final order was signed by a Texas State District Judge, I legally became Reagan Holt, a woman with a new name, new parents, and a family that did not require me to be smaller in order for them to feel whole. I didn't tell my biological family about the adoption, and I didn't tell them when Beckett and I finally acknowledged that the friendship we had built on the back porch of the ranch in Salado was actually the foundation of a life we wanted to build together. I had moved beyond the need for their approval, finding my peace in the steady rhythm of the Fort Cavazos flight line and the slow, honest routines of hill country life. But as our wedding date in Fredericksburg approached, a vineyard in the heart of Texas wine country, surrounded by the rolling golden hills that had become my real home, a quiet instinct led me to hire a security team for the venue. Because I understood that the family in Pennsylvania were not the kind of people who handled being replaced with grace. It was late April, only 2 months before the wedding, when the first crack appeared. I was sitting in the ready room at the Combat Aviation Brigade headquarters, reviewing a post-flight maintenance log, when my desk phone rang with an East Coast area code I hadn't seen in over a year. It was my mother, Lorraine Caldwell, and she did not open with a greeting or an apology for the 18 months of silence. She demanded to know why she was hearing from a cousin that her eldest daughter was marrying a football coach in Texas, and why the invitations listed Nash and Maeve Holt as the parents of the bride. "I am your mother, Reagan," she said, her voice vibrating with the same razor-sharp certainty that used to make me feel like I was being erased from the inside out. "You don't get to replace your family because you're still holding a grudge over one dinner." I sat at my desk, looking at the patches on my flight suit and the Army Aviation Safety Award on the shelf behind me. And I realized that I was not the woman she was addressing, that the person she was trying to reach no longer existed. I told her, in the calm, steady voice I used during a difficult approach, that I hadn't replaced anyone. They had vacated the position voluntarily, and the Holts had simply filled the space that was left standing empty. She arrived in Killeen less than a week later, standing outside my apartment in the flat, unforgiving light of a Texas afternoon, looking exactly as she had in the Thanksgiving photograph, perfectly composed, perfectly cold, and entirely certain that her authority over my life had not expired. She told me that she would not allow me to be walked down the aisle by strangers, and that she expected an invitation for herself and my father immediately. I stood there in my OCP flight suit, a chief warrant officer in the United States Army, being told by a woman who hadn't asked about my safety in 2 years that I owed her a seat at my wedding. And I told her that the woman walking me toward my future was Maeve Holt, the woman who had legally adopted me while my biological parents were busy pretending I didn't exist. The look on Lorraine Caldwell's face, the shock of a woman who has just learned that the child she discarded found a home without her, was the first time I had ever seen her truly speechless. The weeks before the wedding passed in a haze of preparation and the slow, golden warmth of a Texas spring turning into summer. We flew to Fredericksburg on a Thursday morning, the vineyard hills unrolling beneath the plain in waves of green and gold, and the rehearsal dinner was held in the stone barn of the estate, the long wooden tables set with wildflowers and candles, and the particular kind of quiet joy that comes from being surrounded entirely by people who chose to be there. I woke on my wedding morning to a sky so blue and so wide, it looked like it had been painted specifically for a woman who had spent the last year learning that the world is larger and kinder than the small, cold room she grew up in. I spent the morning with my mother, my real mother, Maeve Holt, getting ready in the bridal suite while the scent of white roses and cedar filled the air. And I felt a calmness I had not expected, the steadiness of a pilot who has finally found the landing zone after a long, turbulent flight. I looked at the program on the vanity, seeing the names Nash and Maeve Holt printed under parents of the bride, and I knew that whatever happened when the doors opened, I was going to stand exactly where I belonged. I was nearly ready when a member of the security team, a retired Marine who approached his work with the quiet seriousness I respected, knocked on the door and told me that a sedan with Pennsylvania plates had just arrived at the vineyard gate. There was an older couple claiming to be my parents, he said, and they were refusing to leave until they spoke with the bride. I took a breath, the way I do before a difficult flight, and I told him to let them in, but to seat them at the very back of the ceremony, and under no circumstances were they to be placed with the family. "Are you sure?" he asked. I told him I was sure, because I wanted them to see. I wanted them to watch the family I had built without them, and I wanted them to understand that the daughter they had decided was expendable had been chosen by people who knew what it meant to hold on. The music began, a soft acoustic melody that sounded like the hill country at dusk, and as the doors opened, I saw the rows of people who had become my real unit. The Holt family, my fellow pilots from the Combat Aviation Brigade, Beckett's coaching staff, and the retired nurses from Darnell who had come to watch one of their own finally come home. I walked down the aisle with my back as straight as it had been on the day I first put on the uniform, my arm linked with Nash Holt, the retired master sergeant who had taught me that a father's job is to protect his daughter's peace, not just her name. I saw Beckett standing at the altar in his dark suit, his eyes fixed on me with a loyalty that made the air in the vineyard feel easy to breathe. And I felt, for the first time in 32 years, that I was exactly where I was supposed to be. But as I reached the halfway point, I felt a familiar, cold vibration from the very last row, the presence of Lorraine and Glenn Caldwell, standing like uninvited guests at a feast that had been built in the space they left empty. I am standing here, watching the woman who called me drama realize that she has been written out of a story she thought she still controlled. And I feel a quiet, steady kind of peace that I didn't expect. Before I tell you what happened when the names were called, the moment the entire room went still, I want to ask you something. Tell me in the comments what you think justice looks like in a situation like this. And then, after you hear what actually happened, tell me, was it enough? And please take a second to press the like button and subscribe if you believe that a family is built by the people who stay. What happened when the announcer called for the parents of the bride is something even the vineyard staff said they had never seen. "Ladies and gentlemen," the announcer said, his voice steady and clear in the warm vineyard air, "please join me in welcoming the parents of the bride, Nash and Maeve Holt." The room erupted in a wave of cheers, the pilots whistling and the retired nurses rising to their feet and the coaching staff pounding the tables with the unrestrained joy of people who had watched this story unfold from the beginning. And the Holts stood from the head table with the quiet, certain grace of two people who had earned their place not through blood, but through the daily, unremarkable act of showing up. And in the very last row, I watched my mother's face go white, her jaw dropping as the truth finally reached her with a force she had not prepared for. She pushed through the crowd before the security team could intercept her, reaching the edge of the family section just as the applause was fading, and she looked at me with a fury that was already collapsing into something smaller and uglier. The particular expression of a woman who has just realized that the power she held for 32 years has expired without anyone asking for her permission. She told me that I could not do this, that I was still a Caldwell, and that I was humiliating the family in front of strangers. Nash Holt stepped forward then, the retired master sergeant whose presence was as steady and as immovable as the limestone beneath the vineyard, and he told her, with the quiet, certain authority of a man who had spent 26 years leading soldiers, that she had not been replaced. She had been succeeded. He told her that 2 years ago, she had left a daughter alone in a diner in Killeen, and that the Holts had simply picked up the things she had decided was too much trouble to carry. Lorraine Caldwell looked around the room at the faces of 100 people who only knew me as a Holt, and I watched the understanding settle across her face like a shadow passing over a field. The slow, irreversible recognition that her claim had expired, and that the daughter she had erased from the Thanksgiving table had built an entire world in the space she left behind. My father stood behind her, his shoulders curved and his eyes wet with a regret that had arrived decades too late to be of any use to the girl I used to be. The security team escorted them quietly toward the exit, their departure as unremarked upon as the daughter they had spent 32 years trying to make invisible. I remember thinking, as I stood there with Beckett's hand in mine and the Holt family around me, and the last of the Texas sunlight catching the vineyard hills in gold, that for my entire life I had believed I was too loud, too difficult, and too much for a family that needed me to be a shadow. But the truth, I realized, was much simpler than that. I wasn't too much. They were just too small to hold the kind of love I had to give. And the fault was never in the offering, but in the hands that refused to open. I realized that my 12 years in the Army, my wings and my strength, were never the sources of my family's discomfort. They were simply the things my family could not control, and people who need to control the people around them will always call the ones they cannot reach dramatic. I am Reagan Holt. I am a Chief Warrant Officer in the United States Army, and for the first time in my life, the seat at the head of the table is mine. I am home.